I'm taking my mistress instead, the text from Richard Whitman read, arriving just after 6:17 a.m., as if it were a reminder about groceries rather than the sentence that quietly ended a 42-year marriage. Eleanor Whitman saw the message while standing in the kitchen of the colonial house they had bought decades earlier, the one with white siding that needed repainting every 7 years and a backyard just under half an acre, enough space for a garden she no longer tended. She did not gasp or sit down. She did not reread the words hoping they would rearrange themselves into something kinder. She simply turned the phone face down on the counter beside her coffee mug, the steam rising steadily as if nothing in the world had shifted. Eleanor had learned long ago that panic wastes time, and time, once lost, rarely returns. The morning light came through the window above the sink, touching the framed photo of Richard in his early 40s, smiling beside a car he had been proud to afford back then, a smile that now felt like it belonged to someone she once knew rather than the man who had just announced he would not be coming home. Outside, the quiet suburban street looked unchanged, the same trimmed lawns, the same flag on the Hendersons' porch across the road, the same recycling bins waiting for pickup, and Eleanor found a strange comfort in how ordinary everything appeared when her life had just been split cleanly in two. Richard had not asked for a conversation. He had not suggested counseling or even a temporary separation. He had simply informed her of a decision already made, one he assumed would leave her waiting, confused, or pleading. Eleanor rinsed her mug, dried it carefully, and placed it upside down on the rack, her movements precise, her breathing even. She did not call a friend. She did not open the laptop to search for explanations. Instead, she walked through the house slowly, as if seeing it for the first time, counting steps out of habit, noting the hardwood floors they had refinished 12 years earlier, the staircase banister Richard had insisted on replacing, the guest bedroom that still held boxes from their last attempt at decluttering. This house had been the container of her adult life, the setting for holidays, arguments, reconciliations, and quiet nights that never made it into photographs. And yet standing there now, Eleanor felt a distance forming between herself and the walls, a clarity she had not expected. Richard believed the house would wait for him, just as he believed she would. He was boarding a flight somewhere warm with Vanessa Cole, a woman whose name Eleanor had heard only in passing, a colleague's acquaintance, someone who laughed too loudly at dinners Richard insisted were harmless. He believed that when he returned, there would be a confrontation, perhaps tears, perhaps bargaining, and then, eventually, a negotiation that favored him because it always had. Eleanor picked up her coat and keys and drove the familiar 3 miles to the real estate office near the town square, passing the elementary school where she once volunteered, the pharmacy where she refilled prescriptions, the diner that served pancakes the size of dinner plates. She parked, checked her reflection in the rearview mirror, and stepped inside with the calm of someone handling an overdue task. The agent, a woman in her early 40s with practical shoes and a polite smile, recognized Eleanor immediately and offered coffee. Eleanor declined and said she wanted to list her house, effective immediately, explaining there was no need to wait for anyone else's schedule. She spoke clearly, asked about timelines, commissions, staging, and average days on market, listening carefully as if this were a business transaction unburdened by memory. The agent mentioned Richard, asked if he would be joining them later, and Eleanor replied that he would not, that the paperwork could proceed without delay. No details were offered, none requested. The house, as it turned out, was in demand. Inventory was low, buyers were eager, and within 48 hours, the listing went live, photographs capturing sunlit rooms and the backyard Eleanor had stopped noticing years ago. Offers arrived faster than Eleanor expected, numbers printed neatly on pages that represented freedom more than loss. She reviewed them without sentiment, choosing the one that closed quickly and cleanly, the one that required no contingencies and no waiting. While Richard sent occasional messages from an unfamiliar time zone, brief and casual, assuming a response would come, Eleanor remained silent, not out of spite, but because there was nothing left to clarify. Silence, she understood, is not absence, it is a decision. By the time Richard's plane touched down and he reached for his phone, expecting explanations or demands, the documents had been signed, the sale finalized, and the house he believed anchored him had already passed into someone else's name. Eleanor was no longer inside those walls, and she had not left in a rush. She had closed the door properly, knowing that some endings do not announce themselves with raised voices or dramatic exits, but with steady hands, careful signatures, and the quiet certainty that not all betrayals deserve an argument. Eleanor Whitman spent the next 48 hours moving through her life with a precision that surprised even herself, not because she felt detached, but because clarity had replaced the constant background noise she had lived with for years. She slept in the guest room the first night after the papers were signed, not out of sadness, but because the master bedroom no longer felt like a shared space that needed preserving. In the morning, she woke before sunrise, as she always had, and listened to the house settle, the soft creak of wood adjusting to the change in temperature, sounds she had once associated with safety. She packed only what mattered, clothing she wore regularly, documents she had kept organized in labeled folders, photographs she did not want strangers handling, leaving behind objects that had long outlived their usefulness. Each drawer she emptied felt less like loss and more like correction, as though she were finally editing a story that had gone on too long. Richard, meanwhile, remained unaware of how thoroughly the ground beneath him had shifted. From his perspective, Eleanor's silence was a delay, a pause before the inevitable confrontation he believed would come. He checked his phone between airport lounges and rental car counters, expecting anger, confusion, or at least questions, unaware that while he was busy explaining his choices to someone new, Eleanor was finalizing arrangements with movers and transferring utilities out of her name. The contrast between their days was sharp, though they never spoke. Eleanor measured progress and tasks completed, keys labeled, accounts closed, while Richard measured time in miles traveled and excuses rehearsed. On the third day, Eleanor met with the attorney again to confirm that everything had been processed correctly, that there would be no loose ends that required discussion later. She asked practical questions about timelines and notifications, her voice steady, her posture relaxed, giving no indication that she had just ended a marriage without ever raising her voice. When she returned to the house for what would be the final walkthrough, the rooms echoed slightly, the absence of furniture changing the acoustics, making every footstep sound deliberate. She paused briefly in the kitchen, running her hand along the counter where she had once rested her phone, the spot where a single message had clarified years of uncertainty. There was no dramatic farewell. She locked the door, placed the keys in the envelope prepared for the closing agent, and drove away without looking back, merging into traffic with the ease of someone who knew exactly where she was going. Richard's realization came slowly, not as a single moment of understanding, but as a series of small disruptions that did not make sense at first. His access code failed at the front door. His key turned uselessly in the lock. A call to Eleanor went straight to voicemail, a new message greeting him politely but distantly, informing him she was unavailable. Confusion gave way to irritation, then to disbelief, as he learned through third parties that the house was no longer theirs, that decisions he assumed would include him had already been made without consultation. Vanessa watched this unfold with a quiet unease she did not voice, recognizing too late that the confidence Richard had displayed was not the same as control. Eleanor, now settled temporarily in a quiet rental just under 10 miles away, spent her evenings reading, organizing, and planning next steps with the same calm efficiency that had defined her days. She did not celebrate. She did not grieve in the way others expected. Instead, she adjusted, understanding that adaptation is a form of strength often mistaken for indifference. The narrative Richard had relied on, the one where Eleanor waited, reacted, and eventually compromised, no longer applied, and the absence of drama was what unsettled him most. Eleanor had not argued, had not explained herself, had not asked for understanding. She had simply acted, decisively and legally, leaving him to confront the consequences of a decision he assumed would only affect her. In that quiet space between what he expected and what had occurred, Eleanor found something she had not realized she had been missing, a sense of authorship over her own life, restored not through confrontation, but through completion. Eleanor Whitman began to understand the full extent of what she had done, not through relief or triumph, but through the subtle shift in how people responded to her, a change so quiet it could have been missed if she were not paying attention. In the days following her move, Conversations became simpler, more direct, as if the absence of Richard removed a layer of noise she had grown accustomed to filtering out. The rental house was modest, just over 1,000 square feet, with neutral walls and windows that faced a line of old maple trees, and Eleanor found that the smaller space suited her. There was less to manage, less to clean, and fewer reminders of habits she no longer needed to accommodate. Each morning, she took a measured walk through the neighborhood, exactly 1 mile according to her watch, passing other early risers who nodded politely without asking questions. She appreciated that no one expected an explanation. Meanwhile, Richard's world continued to contract in ways he did not anticipate. He spent hours on the phone, moving between irritation and disbelief, speaking to attorneys who explained procedures he assumed would favor him, only to discover that legality did not require fairness, only accuracy. The narrative he had rehearsed, one where Eleanor resisted briefly before conceding, failed to materialize, leaving him unprepared for the reality that his leverage had existed only in his own assumptions. Vanessa, sensing the instability beneath his confidence, began asking questions he did not want to answer, practical ones about living arrangements and finances that exposed how little he had actually secured. Eleanor, for her part, focused on the tangible. She updated her mailing address, adjusted automatic payments, and opened a new savings account with funds she had not realized were hers to manage alone. Each task reinforced a sense of control she had not experienced in years, not because she had been oppressed, but because she had gradually allowed her priorities to be deferred. Friends reached out cautiously, offering support without prying, and Eleanor accepted their invitations selectively, choosing conversations that centered on the present rather than the past. When someone mentioned Richard's name, she did not react, neither defending nor condemning him, understanding that indifference often speaks louder than anger. The absence of drama unsettled those who expected a spectacle, yet Eleanor remained consistent, answering questions factually and declining to elaborate. Richard attempted to re-establish contact, sending messages that shifted in tone from confused to conciliatory, suggesting discussions and mutual understanding. But Eleanor did not respond, not out of cruelty, but because she recognized that responding would reopen a dialogue she had already closed. She had learned that closure does not always require agreement, only acceptance. As weeks passed, the practical consequences of her decision became clearer. Richard's access to shared resources diminished, plans he had made relying on familiar comforts dissolved, and the future he had imagined adjusting itself around his choices failed to align. Eleanor watched these developments from a distance, not with satisfaction, but with a calm acknowledgement that outcomes often follow actions without commentary. She spent her evenings reading novels she had postponed, cooking meals scaled for one, and organizing her thoughts with the same discipline she applied to her surroundings. There was no sense of exile, only transition. The house she sold had represented a chapter that no longer reflected her direction, and letting it go created space for something undefined but intentional. Richard, confronted with the permanence of what had occurred, began to understand that Eleanor's silence was not an invitation to negotiate, but a boundary firmly established. Vanessa, realizing that the stability she had assumed would accompany Richard was less certain than she believed, grew distant, her presence no longer reinforcing his confidence. Eleanor did not follow these developments closely, hearing of them only through indirect mentions that confirmed what she already knew, that her decision had altered more than just her own circumstances. In choosing to act without announcement, she had rewritten the terms of engagement entirely. The absence of confrontation, the refusal to perform expected emotions, had denied others the roles they anticipated playing. Eleanor found peace in that denial, recognizing that some endings are not meant to be discussed endlessly but lived through quietly, with dignity intact and purpose restored. Eleanor Whitman noticed that memory began to surface differently once the urgency of action had passed, not as sharp pain, but as quiet observations that rearranged her understanding of the past. Certain moments returned with new clarity, small interactions she had dismissed at the time because they did not seem important enough to challenge. She remembered dinners where Richard spoke more to his phone than to her, weekends that were suddenly rescheduled without explanation, and conversations that ended before they truly began. At the time, She had told herself these were normal shifts, the harmless erosion of familiarity. That long marriages often endure, but now, from the distance she had created, those moments aligned into a pattern she could no longer ignore. The realization did not anger her. Instead, it confirmed that her decision had not been impulsive but overdue. In her quieter days, Eleanor found herself evaluating how often she had adjusted her own expectations to preserve harmony, how frequently she had chosen patience over honesty, believing that stability required silence. That belief had guided her for years, shaping her responses until silence became a habit rather than a choice. Letting go of the house had been symbolic, but letting go of that habit proved more transformative. Richard's attempts to regain footing grew more erratic as weeks passed, his messages oscillating between reassurance and accusation, suggesting misunderstandings and shared responsibility, language designed to reopen negotiation rather than acknowledge finality. Eleanor read none of them, deleting without hesitation, aware that engagement would serve only to validate a dynamic she no longer accepted. She understood now that explanation often benefits the listener more than the speaker, and she had finished providing context for decisions that required none. Her days settled into a rhythm that felt intentional rather than reactive. She volunteered occasionally at a local library, shelving books and exchanging brief conversations that did not require her to define herself by marital status. She attended appointments without coordinating schedules, made purchases without consultation, and discovered a sense of autonomy that felt both unfamiliar and natural. Richard, deprived of the audience he expected, began confronting consequences without mediation. Legal consultations clarified boundaries he assumed were flexible, and social circles adjusted subtly, responding to Eleanor's calm certainty rather than his justifications. Vanessa's presence became inconsistent, her interest evidently tied to stability rather than uncertainty, and Richard found himself explaining more than he anticipated, both to others and to himself. Eleanor did not follow these developments directly, but fragments reached her through mutual acquaintances who spoke carefully, gauging her reaction. She responded with neutral acknowledgement, neither confirming nor denying interpretations, allowing silence to maintain its authority. In reflecting on her marriage, Eleanor recognized that loyalty without reciprocity is not virtue but habit, sustained by fear of disruption rather than commitment. She had mistaken endurance for strength, believing that perseverance alone could correct imbalance, and it was only when imbalance declared itself openly that she permitted herself to act. This understanding did not inspire resentment, only resolve. Eleanor began planning further ahead, considering long-term arrangements, evaluating options with the same measured approach that had guided her recent decisions. She consulted financial advisors, reviewed insurance policies, and reorganized documents with a thoroughness that signaled permanence rather than transition. Each completed task reinforced her sense of authorship, confirming that stability need not depend on another person's choices. Richard's attempts to frame the situation as temporary grew less convincing as time passed, his assumption of reconciliation undermined by Eleanor's consistent absence. She did not block his number. She simply did not respond, allowing the unanswered calls to convey what words might complicate. In choosing restraint over confrontation, Eleanor reclaimed control not only over outcomes, but over narrative itself. The story Richard might have told, one of misunderstanding and eventual compromise, no longer applied, replaced by a reality defined by completed actions rather than ongoing debate. Eleanor understood that the most effective boundaries are often unspoken, upheld through consistency rather than explanation. As she settled into this understanding, she felt no need to announce her piece. It existed quietly, sustained by the knowledge that she had responded to betrayal not with spectacle, but with clarity, reshaping her life in a way that required no validation beyond its own permanence. Eleanor Whitman understood that stability, once reclaimed, requires reinforcement rather than celebration, and she approached this phase of her life with the same discipline that had guided her earlier decisions. As the weeks turned into months, she focused on solidifying arrangements that would prevent future disruptions, not out of fear, but out of respect for her own time and energy. She reviewed legal documents carefully, ensuring beneficiaries, permissions, and contingencies reflected her present reality rather than an outdated assumption of permanence. Each signature she placed felt deliberate, a confirmation that she no longer deferred critical matters in the hope that circumstances would correct themselves. Richard's attempts to regain influence became sporadic and increasingly indirect, messages filtered through acquaintances or phrased as practical concerns rather than emotional appeals. He asked about shared accounts that no longer existed and obligations that had already been resolved, discovering that the infrastructure he once relied upon had been dismantled quietly and completely. Eleanor did not take satisfaction in his confusion, but she recognized it as an inevitable consequence of his miscalculation. He had mistaken familiarity for control, believing that history alone could anchor the future, and Eleanor had demonstrated otherwise through methodical action rather than argument. Vanessa, now absent from his communications entirely, had moved on without explanation, leaving Richard to confront the reality that alliances formed under assumptions of comfort rarely withstand instability. Eleanor, meanwhile, invested her attention in constructing routines that reinforced independence. She joined a small community group that met weekly for discussions on literature and current events, appreciating conversations that engaged her perspective without probing her past. She reorganized her finances with professional guidance, diversifying investments and planning for long-term security, actions that replaced uncertainty with clarity. The process was not hurried. It was thorough, reflecting her understanding that permanence is built incrementally. When acquaintances mentioned Richard's situation, Eleanor listened politely and redirected the conversation, declining to participate in speculation. She recognized that detachment is not indifference but discernment, the ability to choose which narratives deserve attention. Over time, the absence of reaction became its own statement, signaling finality more effectively than confrontation ever could. Richard eventually attempted a formal meeting, proposing closure under the guise of mutual respect, but Eleanor declined through her attorney, communicating boundaries without personal engagement. She had no desire to revisit discussions that presumed shared authority where none remained. This refusal was not punitive. It was protective, ensuring that progress was not undermined by revisiting resolved matters. Eleanor found that her energy, once conserved, expanded naturally, allowing her to pursue interests she had postponed for years. She enrolled in a short course on financial literacy, not because she lacked competence, but because knowledge reinforced confidence. She traveled modestly, choosing destinations within a few hundred miles, appreciating the freedom to decide without negotiation. Each experience affirmed that autonomy, once practiced, becomes self-sustaining. Richard's perception of loss sharpened as opportunities to reassert influence diminished, leaving him to confront the reality that Eleanor's departure had been comprehensive, affecting not only property but process. Eleanor did not monitor his adjustment, trusting that accountability follows awareness. She had learned that responsibility cannot be transferred through explanation. It must be assumed through consequence. As she reflected on her journey, Eleanor acknowledged that the most significant shift had occurred internally, a recalibration of priorities that placed self-respect above preservation of appearance. She no longer measured success by endurance or compromise, but by alignment between values and actions. This alignment provided a sense of peace that did not require affirmation from others. In choosing to conclude one chapter decisively, Eleanor had opened space for a future defined not by reaction but by intention, a future she continued to shape with quiet confidence and unwavering resolve. Eleanor Whitman reached a point where the noise surrounding her absence began to fade, replaced by a quieter understanding that what remained was no longer reaction but consequence unfolding at its own pace. Time did not rush to resolve anything for Richard, and Eleanor did not intervene to soften its effects. She continued building a life structured around predictability and self-direction, understanding that consistency is the most reliable form of protection. Her days were full without being crowded, marked by deliberate choices rather than obligations inherited from habit. She maintained her morning walks, extended them occasionally to 2 miles when the weather allowed, noticing how the seasons shifted without asking permission, how change occurred regardless of readiness. Richard, in contrast, found himself confronting an accumulation of unresolved matters that could no longer be redirected toward Eleanor. Financial adjustments he had postponed required immediate attention, and professional relationships once supported by the stability of his home life grew strained as his personal circumstances became visible. He attempted to reconstruct control by revisiting old patterns, reaching out through familiar channels, but each attempt confirmed that the access he expected had expired. Eleanor's refusal to engage did not escalate tension, it neutralized it, leaving no friction to respond against. Mutual acquaintances adapted to the new reality, recalibrating their interactions without explicit instruction. Invitations were extended to Eleanor independently, no longer framed as extensions of her marriage, and she accepted selectively, reinforcing her autonomy through presence rather than explanation. Richard's narrative, once assumed to be shared, became singular, unsupported by the context he relied upon to make sense of his decisions. Eleanor observed this shift indirectly, not with satisfaction, but with recognition that outcomes follow structure. She spent time refining her plans further, considering housing options that reflected long-term comfort rather than compromise. She visited properties without urgency, assessing neighborhoods, calculating distances to essential services, evaluating practicality over sentiment. Each visit reinforced her awareness that choice, when exercised without pressure, becomes a source of confidence. Richard's circumstances, increasingly constrained, led him to reassess assumptions he had never questioned. Without Eleanor managing details quietly in the background, responsibilities accumulated visibly, demanding attention he had previously deferred. He encountered obstacles that could not be negotiated away, learning that familiarity does not substitute for preparation. Eleanor did not track his progress, but the contrast between their trajectories became evident through the stability she experienced. Her finances were organized, her schedule predictable, her environment reflective of intention rather than inertia. She recognized that peace is not passive. It is maintained through decisions reinforced daily. In conversations with those who knew fragments of her story, Eleanor remained factual and reserved, neither embellishing nor minimizing events. This approach discouraged speculation, allowing her experiences to stand without interpretation. Richard, deprived of narrative reinforcement, faced the reality that explanations offered too late often serve only to comfort the speaker. Eleanor's silence continued to function as a boundary, not an invitation, reinforcing finality through repetition. She found that energy once expended managing emotional uncertainty now supported clarity and foresight. She planned modest trips, attended lectures, and engaged in activities that aligned with her interests rather than expectations. Each choice affirmed her capacity to define fulfillment independently. Richard's attempts to regain footing revealed a gradual understanding that reconciliation was not an option to be negotiated, but a door already closed. Eleanor's life did not broadcast triumph or loss. It demonstrated resolution through continuity. In choosing not to respond, she allowed the narrative to conclude on its own terms, leaving no ambiguity about authorship. What remained was not absence but presence redirected, a life proceeding without reference to what no longer applied, sustained by intention rather than reaction. Eleanor Whitman encountered the moment she had anticipated without actively awaiting it, the point at which Richard fully understood that there would be no return to familiar ground. It arrived not through conversation but through absence, when practical barriers replaced emotional ones and assumptions failed to open doors they once had. Richard attempted to access resources he believed remained shared, only to find permissions revoked and processes closed, confirmations arriving from institutions that recognized Eleanor's authority alone. The realization unsettled him more than anger ever could, because it offered no surface to argue against. Eleanor's life continued with steady momentum, marked by choices that reinforced independence rather than reacted to disruption. She finalized plans for a permanent residence, selecting a quiet neighborhood within 15 miles of essential services, prioritizing walkability and maintenance over size or prestige. The home she chose was efficient, with a small yard requiring minimal care and a layout that reflected intention rather than accommodation. Moving day was uneventful, handled by professionals who completed the task within hours, leaving Eleanor free to arrange her space according to preference rather than compromise. She unpacked methodically, placing items where they belonged without revisiting memories attached to them, understanding that context changes meaning. Richard's attempts to regain footing escalated briefly, not in volume but in urgency, as he confronted the permanence of Eleanor's decisions. He sought validation from mutual acquaintances, framing circumstances as misunderstandings, hoping repetition might alter outcome. These efforts yielded limited sympathy, as Eleanor's consistent calm contrasted with his explanations, signaling resolution rather than conflict. Vanessa's departure from his life became evident through silence rather than announcement, her absence another consequence he had not anticipated. Eleanor learned of this indirectly and without reaction, recognizing that her choices had rearranged dynamics beyond her immediate concern. She remained focused on consolidating her position, updating records, finalizing arrangements, and establishing routines that reinforced stability. Her days were predictable but not stagnant, structured around activities that engaged her interests and supported well-being. She attended community meetings, contributed her perspective thoughtfully, and withdrew without explanation when discussions no longer served her time. Richard, confronted with diminished options, began to understand that the absence of response was not neglect but boundary, one maintained through consistency rather than confrontation. Eleanor's refusal to engage denied him the opportunity to redefine terms or reopen dialogue, leaving outcomes to stand on their own. She understood that control is not asserted through dominance, but through authorship, the ability to define one's narrative without negotiation. As months progressed, Eleanor's life reflected continuity rather than recovery, her choices reinforcing a sense of authorship she had reclaimed through action. She traveled modestly, visiting nearby towns and reconnecting with interests she had set aside, appreciating the freedom to decide without consensus. Each experience affirmed that fulfillment does not require validation from those no longer present. Richard's situation stabilized eventually, though not in the way he had anticipated, shaped by constraints rather than entitlement. Eleanor did not observe this with satisfaction or regret, only acknowledgement that consequences align with decisions. Her silence remained consistent, not as punishment, but as clarity, signaling that certain chapters conclude without epilogue. In choosing not to revisit what had ended, Eleanor preserved energy for what continued, demonstrating that resolution is often quieter than expected. Her life moved forward without reference to what had been left behind, sustained by intention, reinforced by structure, and defined by the quiet certainty that comes from acting decisively and allowing outcomes to follow without commentary. Eleanor Whitman came to recognize that the final stage of separation is not defined by distance, but by detachment, the moment when events related to the past no longer provoke reaction because they no longer hold authority. This understanding emerged gradually as her life settled into patterns that felt self-sustaining, requiring no adjustment to accommodate another person's unpredictability. She noticed it one afternoon while organizing documents in her new home, realizing that she no longer anticipated interruptions or delayed decisions. The quiet around her was not empty, it was complete. Richard's presence had receded into abstraction, his name appearing only in administrative contexts that no longer demanded personal engagement. Eleanor handled these matters efficiently, responding through appropriate channels without emotional investment, confirming that closure had become procedural rather than personal. Her routines reflected this shift. She maintained regular schedules, planned activities weeks in advance, and evaluated opportunities based on interest rather than obligation. The sense of urgency that once accompanied uncertainty had dissipated, replaced by patience grounded in stability. Eleanor found satisfaction in small confirmations of independence, such as managing repairs without consultation or making travel plans based solely on preference. These actions were unremarkable individually but cumulative in effect, reinforcing autonomy through repetition. Richard, in contrast, experienced the consequences of detachment as isolation rather than clarity. His attempts to reinterpret the past encountered resistance not through confrontation but through indifference, as Eleanor's absence from the narrative left no counterpart to validate his perspective. Conversations he initiated stalled without response, leaving explanations unacknowledged. Over time, he confronted the reality that Eleanor's silence was not a pause awaiting reconciliation, but a conclusion sustained through consistency. Eleanor observed none of this directly, yet the contrast between their trajectories became evident through the stability she experienced. Her environment reflected intention, from the arrangement of furniture to the organization of time. She hosted gatherings selectively, inviting individuals whose presence added value rather than obligation. Discussions were grounded in current interests rather than retrospective analysis, allowing Eleanor to participate fully without revisiting resolved matters. She recognized that fulfillment does not require constant affirmation, but alignment between choices and values. Financial security reinforced this understanding, as careful planning translated into predictability, eliminating the anxiety that often accompanies transition. Eleanor's decisions continued to reflect foresight rather than reaction, confirming that independence, once established, strengthens through maintenance. Richard's awareness of finality emerged not through a single realization, but through accumulated evidence that access had been permanently restricted. Invitations ceased, updates no longer included him, and decisions unfolded without reference to his input. This absence of acknowledgement underscored a truth he had underestimated, that Eleanor's role in his life had extended beyond companionship into structure, and without it, coherence diminished. Eleanor did not interpret this as victory or loss, only as outcome, understanding that responsibility redistributed itself when balance shifted. Her focus remained forward, considering possibilities unburdened by prior constraints. She explored interests that encouraged growth, attending workshops and lectures that engaged her intellect without requiring justification. Each experience reinforced her sense of agency, affirming that life continues not by revisiting what has ended but by investing in what evolves. Eleanor's silence persisted not as an act of withholding, but as confirmation that dialogue had concluded. She understood that not all endings require explanation, and that dignity often resides in restraint rather than exposition. In choosing not to narrate her decisions publicly, she preserved their integrity, allowing actions to communicate without distortion. Her life progressed with understated assurance, marked by continuity rather than disruption. The past remained acknowledged but uninvited, its influence diminished by the present stability. Eleanor found peace not in closure defined by words, but in consistency demonstrated through living, confirming that some resolutions are achieved not through confrontation, but through sustained independence and quiet certainty. Eleanor Whitman did not mark the end of this chapter with ceremony or reflection, because by the time it arrived, the ending had already settled into her life so naturally that naming it felt unnecessary. She moved forward without glancing back, not from denial but from understanding that attention is a form of permission, and she no longer granted it to what had concluded. Her days continued with a steadiness that required no defense, shaped by routines she trusted and decisions she made without hesitation. The home she lived in reflected this assurance, each object placed with intention, each space serving a purpose rather than preserving a memory. Eleanor found satisfaction in the ordinary, recognizing that peace often announces itself quietly, without demand. She maintained her health carefully, scheduled appointments when needed, cooked meals that suited her tastes, and managed her affairs with confidence that came from familiarity rather than dependence. The absence of Richard no longer registered as loss or relief. It had become a fact, like a season that passed without ceremony. Information about his life reached her less frequently, not because people were withholding it, but because there was nothing left to report that concerned her. Richard's presence in her world had diminished to legal formality and distant recollection, neither requiring response. Eleanor understood that finality does not always arrive through confrontation or closure, but through consistency, sustained over time. She continued to engage selectively with her community, offering insight where appropriate, and withdrawing without explanation when conversations drifted toward the past. Her identity no longer required contrast, no longer needed to be defined by what she had endured or escaped. It stood on its own, supported by choices that aligned with her values. She invested in experiences that encouraged growth rather than validation, attending events that challenged her perspective and expanded her understanding. Travel became a source of curiosity rather than escape, each destination chosen for interest rather than symbolism. Eleanor recognized that independence is not a destination reached once, but a practice maintained through daily decisions. Richard's narrative, once assumed to include her participation, concluded without acknowledgement, its resolution determined by absence rather than agreement. Eleanor did not seek to correct misunderstandings or clarify motives, understanding that explanation often extends influence unnecessarily. Her silence remained deliberate, not as punishment, but as preservation of clarity. Over time, even the temptation to revisit what had ended faded, replaced by confidence in the life she had constructed. Eleanor found that fulfillment did not require dramatic transformation, only alignment between intention and action. She continued planning for the future with realism rather than fear, adjusting expectations based on evidence rather than hope. Financial security provided reassurance, but it was autonomy that sustained her peace. She accepted that some relationships conclude without reconciliation, and that dignity often resides in restraint rather than response. Eleanor's life did not present itself as a lesson or example. It existed simply as proof that resolution can be achieved without spectacle. In choosing decisiveness over debate, she had reclaimed authorship of her narrative, allowing events to conclude on their own terms. The quiet certainty that followed required no affirmation. Eleanor lived within it fully, confident that what she had built would endure because it was grounded in intention rather than reaction. The story did not demand a final statement, because the outcome was evident in the continuity of her life, steady, unencumbered, and complete.